One of the most distinctive visual techniques used in the mid to late 90s was pre-rendered 3D backgrounds. In its simplest form, this is a static image from a fixed camera position. This is a technique that sadly is no longer used much today thanks to modern 3D. But back during the PS1 era, it was everywhere. Many games including Resident Evil, Final Fantasy VIII, Parasite Eve and Chrono Cross all used pre-rendered 3D backgrounds. Instead of rendering a full 3D environment in real time, artists would create still images of scenery offline and push them to powerful Silicon Graphics workstations. This offline scene was then introduced into the game, and often it would incorporate 3D characters walking through them that would seamlessly blend in with the backgrounds. While the backgrounds were static, characters could interact with the background, climb stairs and ladders, pick up objects, move behind areas, all perfectly executed. Some games would superimpose live geometry into the scene to give it more interactivity. The Legend of Dragoon often would include water effects in the scene that looked just incredible at the time. The PlayStation 1 is often regarded as the system that introduced pre-rendered 3D backgrounds to video games. And while this is partially true, its main rivals, the Sega Saturn and Nintendo 64, also ran games that used pre-rendered backgrounds. The real precursor to PS1 style pre-rendered backgrounds actually began on the 16-bit Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. In order to bridge the gap between generations, some games began to incorporate backgrounds and graphics that were generated on powerful Silicon Graphics workstations offline, then downsampled them for 16-bit hardware. This allowed for visuals that looked next-gen. Donkey Kong Country would use 3D modeling software to create characters, animations, and environments, then rendered them as sprites and background tiles in the game. On the Sega Genesis, Vector Man used pre-rendered 3D models for the main character and environments, and 1996's Sonic 3D Blast also applied similar techniques and used an isometric perspective. This entire workflow set the stage for the 32-bit era. When the PlayStation launched, it heralded a new generation, but the PS1 came with many tricks up its sleeve. Yes, it did have fast 3D, but its CD-ROM storage meant larger detailed games. It also had strong 2D and motion decoding capabilities on board. Not only could complex backgrounds be loaded in, they could be decoded very efficiently. The pre-rendered 3D workflow introduced from the 16-bit era was refined, and the PlayStation was the ideal system. Developers would model 3D backgrounds often on SGI workstations and would add lighting and shadows and render them as static backgrounds. In the games, they appear as a large textured quad that covers the screen. Then real-time 3D characters and objects are rendered on top of them using the GPU pipeline. Now back in the day, you were playing games like this on a CRT, so the characters, objects that you could interact with were blended perfectly into the background. But as we can see, if we enable wireframe mode, objects are individual geometry elements. In many games, there would be some visual indicator to let the player know that this object or item could be interacted with. Because cameras were fixed per room, the perspective always matched. But if we said that pre-rendered 3D backgrounds is just a static image, how did the characters apply depth to the scene? In other words, how does the game know that the character is moving behind objects instead of moving in front of them? Adding depth to a 3D pre-rendered background is very important to sell the illusion. As we know, the PlayStation has no hardware Z or depth buffer, so everything had to be done by hand. Depth and occlusion were handled a few different ways depending on the game. In the simplest forms, developers would implement ordering tables or layers, essentially keeping track of where they should be layering. For example, distant walls that were furthest away, mid-ground pillars or bookshelves as second, and foreground furniture as third. These layers were given depth values in the ordering table. When a character walked behind a table or a pillar, the foreground layer was drawn after the character, occluding it. But the game would also need to understand collision. In some games, this was a simple bounding box. In The Legend of Dragoon, you can clearly see the object collision and trigger zones if we enable the wireframe geometry. But some games that use 3D pre-rendered backgrounds would use a more complex pre-rendered 3D depth map alongside the color image. In the software, the engine would compare each character's polygon depth against the map for precise occlusion without the need for layers. This technique of 3D pre-rendered backgrounds got more refined over time, with some games bringing in other features of the PlayStation 1. Adding post-processing effects over the top of the background was also widely used to bring scenes to life. I love this scene here in The Legend of Dragoon, but it looks very static because there is nothing going on. Then compare it to this scene here. Just by adding a few touches in specific parts of the background can really make the scene look so much more alive. Some games would also implement some cool effects. When moving over shiny surfaces, we can see reflections appearing in the ground as well as in doorways, or full reflections in mirrors. Lighting and shadowing were crucial to sell the effect. In Parasite Eve 2, it even uses the PlayStation 1's motion decoder to stream in movie-style background data on the fly as the character moves. This was also used in the game's Fear Effect 1 and 2, using the PS1 streaming capabilities to load and decode the next chunk asynchronously as you explore. This hybrid of static pre-rendered images and short dynamic FMV style sequences is what gives Parasite Eve 2 its polished cinematic look. There are many great PlayStation 1 games with pre-rendered 3D backgrounds, and it's definitely fair to say that this effect was widely used. Unlike 3D that tends to age over time, 3D pre-rendered backgrounds have aged like fine wine. They retained all the charm and personality, making these works of art still look incredible all these years later. But as we've said, although the PS1 made this technique famous, the Sega Saturn also ran games with pre-rendered 3D backgrounds, and it's an interesting comparison to the different methods in serving them up to the player. We said that the PS1 has powerful and efficient decoding hardware. The Sega Saturn does not, but it does have other tricks up its sleeve. The Saturn comes with two graphics process units on board, VDP1 and VDP2. Now, generally speaking, VDP2 is responsible for rendering background graphics, and it works in conjunction with VDP1 to render the image on the screen. And in theory, this makes the Saturn a 2D hybrid powerhouse and excellent at layering visuals, and this gives the edge over the PlayStation 1. The VDP2 chip can handle large background planes very efficiently, which frees up VDP1 for characters and dynamic objects, and the parallel processing gave the Saturn advantage in raw 2D fill rate and effects. However, this complicates things when pre-rendered images would require many unique camera angles, and in some games, memory constraints would often force developers to texture map pre-rendered images onto VDP1 as quads instead of a pure VDP2 plane. Just like the PlayStation, the Saturn had no full hardware Z buffer and made use of layering and ordering. However, VDP2 had settings for handling background layers. Developers could even split pre-rendered images into foreground, midground, background layers and assign them to different VDP2 planes. 3D characters were drawn on VDP1 and sorted into the sprite frame buffer. VDP2 would enable nicer parallax scrolling, scaling, and even subtle 3D positioning on planes, which could enhance the illusion of depth in pre-rendered scenes. And this can be seen in some real-world examples. The Saturn version of Resident Evil had slightly sharper and more detailed backgrounds with subtle extra touches. Characters sometimes appear more textured and blended more cohesively due to the different shading. The PS1 version looks softer and has some placement issues with ground textures. Overall, the Saturn's backgrounds look crisper and more saturated. But the trade-off, of course, was more complex programming was needed. But in the right hands, the Sega Saturn was more than capable of producing 3D pre-rendered backgrounds as well as the PlayStation 1. The Nintendo 64, on the other hand, took a fundamentally different approach to its graphics. It was designed around real-time 3D polygons with hardware features that made full 3D environments more feasible. It came with true hardware Z buffering for automatic occlusion and sorting of polygons. However, the RDP or Reality Display Processor only has 4 kilobytes of texture memory, limiting large or high-res textures without heavy optimization or custom microcode. And most importantly, cartridge storage space was tiny compared to CD-ROMs, making massive libraries of pre-rendered images impractical. Of course, Resident Evil 2, the impossible port by Angel Studios, showed that the N64 could indeed pull off a full game on a single cartridge. It retained all the 3D rendered backgrounds, but at a lower resolution and fidelity than the PlayStation 1 original. On the other hand, depth and occlusion worked via the hardware Z buffering, and it was more robust than the PlayStation 1 software tricks. Some other games made use of 3D pre-rendered backgrounds, including The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask. But compared to the PlayStation 1, they look quite sterile in comparison to what was possible. And in conclusion, I think many attribute 3D pre-rendered backgrounds to the PlayStation 1 because it had a simple rendering pipeline that made it a go-to system to develop games that had a cinematic, survival horror, or an RPG element to it. The Saturn ran very powerful 2D, but was harder to develop on, and the hardware favored layered arcade-style games beyond anything else. But perhaps its full potential was never uncovered. And of course, on the Nintendo 64, it did what it did best, run incredible 3D games. It was all about developing to the strengths of the hardware, and that's what made the 5th generation so awesome. We had 3 different systems with 3 completely different architectures, and developers used the strengths of each to generate some incredible stuff. As for me, I absolutely adore 3D-rendered 3D backgrounds on the PlayStation 1. It was a magical time where you let your imagination run wild. It felt like every scene was a painting and you were inside of it, and it felt like video games had reached their peak. And in some ways, I still think that holds true. Games nowadays just aren't the same, and maybe it's just the nostalgia talking, but I do miss these old days. Even modern remakes and remasters of some of these old classics, while good in their own right, lose so much of what made the original so incredible. But that of course is just my opinion. We are going to leave it here for today's episode. I do hope you enjoyed this look back at pre-rendered 3D environments on the PlayStation 1 and some examples on the Sega Saturn and the N64, but let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. As always, if you like this episode, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and we will catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.